All right, so Oval Office meetings have long been seen as controlled presidential engagements that are used by the U.S. head of state to put forward the very best of what the White House has to offer. But there's recently been increasing concern that guests should expect the unexpected, and Ramaphosa's visit yesterday is probably a case in point. The president reckons the engagement nonetheless went well, but his office has admitted that there may have been an orchestrated plan cobbled up to stir drama for the cameras. What should we read into this? Let's bring in our guest. Wits School of Governance Professor Kondlo joins us now, as well as UJ Professor Chris Landsberg, who also happens to be an advisor to International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola. To both our guests, it's lovely to have you. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Professor Landsberg, perhaps I can begin with you. Yesterday, we really saw all of Ramaphosa's diplomatic prowess on test for the world to see, and I wonder how well you reckon he's done.
So you're asking the question about how well the president done, or the U.S. president?
Ramaphosa, specifically.
I want to start by saying the president and the entire South African delegation, maybe even the media, must have been caught off guard totally when the lights in the White House started to be dimmed for a camera show. Now, let me take you a step back. I wish to state to you, you've said that I also work with Minister Lamola. I subscribe fully to the idea that this was orchestrated. Remember, I'm saying I'm also working with colleagues behind the scenes. It was orchestrated. Let me break it down for you just in 30 seconds. I think the one side had a clear idea of what the other side's agenda is, and no prices for guessing who it is. President Ramaphosa was meticulous in saying what brought them to Washington. Whether the South Africans had a view of what Washington planned and the Oval Office planned, I don't think that happened. So to the extent that it is now described worldwide by networks throughout the world that it was an orchestrated Oval ambush, I think that is absolutely spot on. But our president kept his calm under the circumstances. I just think he could have used his ministers a bit more, because they have details on their fingertips, and they could have nipped the issue of mass murder and genocide in the bud.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a good point to raise my next question with you, Professor Kondlo. This concept that we could have gone just a bit further in pushing back against Donald Trump. You know, I've heard examples of how the president could have cited South Africa's murder rate, for example, and used that to contextualize the murders against specifically white farmers. Questions around whether we should have brought up the case around the Kill the Boer song that made it all the way to the Constitutional Court.
Yes, Ayanda, you're absolutely right. But my feeling is that there wasn't really enough time to deal with issues as exhaustively as they are supposed to be dealt with. I actually thought President Donald Trump was going to allow more time to discuss, especially the footage that he showed, and allowed South Africans to respond to it. Because what I find strange with President Trump is that he doesn't seem to be a details person. You see? I mean, when you make such serious allegations and you actually believe them about another country, it's important to pay attention to detail. And the South African delegation as well, I think it was very important to go to that meeting with every important empirical detail. Because when you're dealing with governments that are right-wing oriented, you need to be ready with empirical detail, especially on matters that are debatable. And I think that's not what our team actually did. Or if they did, it goes back to the point I raised about time allocated and the facilitation of the discussion by President Donald Trump, which I think the facilitation was very jumpy, very erratic. I don't think the facilitation was good.
But I wonder how many people, Professor Landsberg, went into that thinking that Donald Trump was going to change his mind. And I asked that question specifically to try and get into the minds of the people who were in the room about essentially cutting their losses given what was at stake there. We knew that the cameras were rolling, and in some respects, those who are of the impression that this was orchestrated say it was done so specifically in front of the cameras to drive through some kind of narrative.
And let me build on, answer your question by building on what Professor Kondlo said. First of all, Prof. Kondlo, former colleague, this is one of the lengthiest, what we call tete-a-tete. In other words, meetings between the two principal leaders alone. I mean, that's the tradition in diplomacy. Clearly, President Trump has changed that by now having this tradition where he sits there with his counterpart and the teams flank each other on the side. You say there was not enough time to go into detail. I can tell you, first of all, that I think the team, certainly the team from government, had all those preparations, had all those details, were ready. I said it was one of the longest, but it was carefully choreographed, even what you call the chaotic nature, where I think you have to give President Ramaphosa credit. Even as President Trump tried to almost give limited space for reactions on controversial issues, President Ramaphosa at times insisted on getting his viewpoint in. Just one example, and then we can move on. On the point of the kill the farmer, kill the boer song, which the Constitutional Court found not to be illegal, the president jumped in and said, our Constitutional Court found in favor of it, but we also have a constitution that allows for freedom of speech. But I can tell you now, if you had given that to the Minister of International Relations or the Minister of Intelligence, she would have had those or he would have had those details of numbers, figures, on top of their heads, because they prepared for every eventual scenario. What they did not see coming is President Trump allowing the meeting to be dominated about a falsehood which even BBC claimed a false information about genocide, and to rely on two video footages from opposition forces as intelligence to make the case for genocide. That is absolutely poor intelligence, to put it mildly.
Sure. BBC, CNN, we're seeing a lot of pushback from international media who also agree that this may have been an ambush. With your indulgence, gentlemen, as you can imagine, there's plenty of reaction to what took place. And we're told that the Secretary General of the ANC has also just made himself available to speak to us. I'm hoping you can stay on the line so that we can perhaps make sense of Fikile Mbalula's sentiments about this. But our two guests who are helping us unpack all of this, of course, were listening in to that, and to both our profs, that's Kwandiwe Kondlo and Chris Landsberg. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm hoping you were able to catch on to most of what was said there. Professor Landsberg, let me get your initial impressions.
No, I think it was a lot of information to digest. I mean, I can definitely say to you that one of the issues that the Secretary General would have dealt with in April is, for example, this constant harping on the notion that Iran, for example, paid for our ICJ case, but the information is simply not forthcoming to the extent that the sanctions issue loomed large. I wouldn't be surprised. But let me take the opportunity on that point of that bill in which sanctions is invoked and other issues. Here's the irony. President Trump is currently speaking to President Putin and has broken ranks with at least 27 years of foreign policy. Why is South Africa still on a list of Russia being an enemy of the United States? The United States is not only talking to Iran at the moment over its nuclear program, but the proposal on the table is exactly what South Africa is putting on the table. Iran, open up for the IAEA, show that you don't have weapons, insist on a nuclear civilian program, just like South Africa did. Why is South Africa still on that list? Why is that list not removed? Final point for now, because I see there's some business colleagues who also want to join. There's a contestation for South Africa's foreign policy. And here's what I'm taking away from yesterday. And I agree with the Secretary General. For the president to go and to be given the opportunity to engage the US president over misunderstandings and spelling out a list of what he regards as priorities, from trade, aid, cooperation, G20, etc., I think is laudable. But one thing we have to get clear, and now I'm speaking as somebody who works with the Minister of International Relations, Washington will remain, certainly in South Africa's eyes, a strategic partner of the United States. But Washington and America is no longer the fulcrum, the be-all and end-all. And neither is Europe the be-all and end-all of South Africa's foreign policy. South Africa has a diversified spread of a universalized foreign policy in which America and BRICS count the same weight.
Professor Kondlo, let me give you the final bite of the cherry, though. You know, there's a saying about hindsight being 20/20. It's much easier to make sense of events when looking backwards. The Secretary General is saying that they didn't go to the US to argue a case. And I wonder, as we round off, whether you reckon the objective was achieved, whatever you understand that objective to be.
Okay, and are you talking about the objective of the president's meeting?
That's right.
With President Donald Trump. My view, Ayanda, is that this is the start of a journey. It's also a very important journey because it's a journey during the Trump moment. I call it a Trump moment because within a short time, it's going to be over. It is going to be over. And some of the strategic choices and decisions and commitments that we make during this time, we need to make them with serious strategic foresight. Foresight which goes beyond the 4 years of Mr. Donald Trump. You see, there is a saying that democracy is a very strong system of governance all over the world because democracy retrieves its own mistakes. Democracy retrieves its own mistakes. When American democracy retrieves its own mistakes, we would like to be found on the right side. So the journey that South Africa has started right now, it's a very important one. I take my hat off for President Ramaphosa. It's a very important one. I take my hat off for the advisory teams to the various ministers who are so centrally involved in these developments. They're doing a lot of work, great work for the country as a whole, not just for a particular political party. They're doing great work. But I'm going to emphasize the point I made. the importance of making sure now that given the kind of administration we're dealing with in the US, it's important to have empirical detail of facts, especially in the areas we know are of concern in our international relations.
If you have 30 seconds left, just to respond to Prof.
Sure, let's make it 25, Prof.
Okay, 25. The details are there. But I would be the first to say if there's one thing that we should take out of yesterday is that nobody emphasized that there is genocide. But more importantly, we have to get our house in order. Whether it's President Trump or others who complain about criminality and the state of service delivery, our development, our economy, I think we should take those as positives, even from President Trump.
Fair enough. There's certainly a discussion outstanding back at home once the president touches down to get a sense of how we can solve the issues that everybody in the room agreed exists. But to both our guests, thanks very much indeed for your time and, in fact, your patience. Really do appreciate it. Professor Kondlo is with Wits School of Governance. Professor Chris Landsberg with the University of Johannesburg, also advisor to International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola. To both of you, I'm deeply indebted. Thanks very much indeed. All right, so we'll continue, of course, making sense of what's taken place over the next couple of days, I imagine, as we take in the reaction that's still pouring in.